Good afternoon, everyone. This is absolutely fabulous. Happy New Year. And I know for many of you, this is like a double header, right? This is like really great. And we appreciate you coming for the second part of this too. And for those who did not know about the paper conservation talk earlier, talk to a neighbor. They may tell you more about it. But this is a very special program for a number of reasons. One being that this is the final program for the Barberini Tapestries. So that exhibition is on view through Sunday. Make sure you see it again. Tell others. All those people like, oh, I meant to get over there. Those are the people you need to tell. You need to get over there. And also because we have an opening this weekend of Keith Acapul's incredible paintings inspired by nature, it can make it even more worthwhile for you to come to see those again and to see Keith's work. So we have our opening on Friday, public opening 6 to 8, and if you remember 5 to 6. So please do that. It's also wonderful because Vera is one of our faculty, and it's always great to be able to celebrate the work that we do at this university. So I thank you for being part of that. And also because we're dealing with the science of color. And as an art museum, we often don't get to do science programs in a way. So it's really great when we can connect those together. So a little background, which you may know, and I'm sorry if I pronounce any of these names incorrectly, but please forgive me. But Vera Keller is Associate Professor of History in the Clark Honors College. She specializes in the history of science in the long 17th century. Her book, Knowledge and the Public Interest, was published in 2015, and she is the author of more than 20 articles and book chapters and the editor of 4 volumes and special issues. She's a busy scholar. Today's talk relates to her research on Cornelis Drebbel, the Dutch alchemist and artist who invented a lucrative cochineal-based scarlet dye in the early 16th century, and on Theodore de Mayerne, the royal physician and connoisseur of artistic techniques who worked long and hard to steal Drebbel's secrets. So this is kind of a mystery, which is great. But please join me in welcoming Vera Keller.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks you, Dill. And I'm so pleased to be part of this outstanding series of programs and this incredible exhibition. The secrets that were stolen about the cochineal dye shall remain a mystery because they will not be the subject of my talk tonight. I'm happy to discuss them further with you, but today I'm going to stay much more in Roman territory, in the territory of the wonderful tapestries that you can see and I hope already have seen upstairs. So, as Thomas Campbell reminded us at the Barberini Symposium held in this room a couple months ago in November, appreciating tapestries means taking a journey of the mind. Unlike other art forms like glass, ceramics, or pietra dura, as you can see in the Barberini cabinet in the Metropolitan Museum of Art here, where the riot of color remains vivid centuries later, the tapestries are very faded. We have to reimagine them as the massive displays of color that they once were, displays that were both an aesthetic experience and a demonstration of cultural, scientific, and political power. Dyeing of cloth, in particular, served as evidence for a polity's ability to rival other states, cities, and periods of time. It was one of the preeminent means for illustrating one's ability to understand and transform nature, and to attract artisans and industry in order to fashion a glorious state. The science of the period we often call scientific revolution played out in a courtly rather than an institutional or even often an academic stage. Thus, dramatic abilities to color cloth were prized as a means of proving one's magnificence in an atmosphere of rivalry with the past, in a scientific tournament, as it were. This lecture explores experimental research into textile colors from the period of the Barberini tapestries and points out what was at stake to contemporaries to have this display of color. But let me start by pointing out what is at stake for us in paying attention to color. Currently, in the history of science, there is a great deal of attention to color, and its interest might be obvious to us. But let me take a moment to note why, as a topic, it might not have been so common in recent decades. In large-scale stories about the emergence of modern science, color is often shorthand for an older, closed, and total world system. And here you have an image of the closed universe with the crystalline spheres nestled one with each other, carrying around the planets with earth, air, water, and fire in the center. This is, of course, in the Nuremberg Chronicles, of which we have some images here in the Art Museum's collection, and also the entire volume over in special collections. So color is a shorthand for this kind of universe, one in which the four elements, the four humors, the four seasons interacted with each other and with the planets, where color related to the physical bodily makeup of beings according to an ancient matter theory of the mixture of hot, cold, wet, and dry things, a total system. The mechanical philosophy supposedly destroyed the system, making all matter interchangeable and calculable not by color and quality, but by number. Even the rainbow could be conceptualized by a figure like Descartes here in 1637 as pure geometry, no color needed. When looking at objects in the microscope, color tended to disappear, and color did not exist objectively, according to many philosophers of the period. So Galileo in the Assayer in 1623, for example, says that color does not exist in objects themselves, but rather in the senses of the perceiving subject. It was thus a means of illusion rather than a means towards a greater knowledge of nature for these figures. And later, of course, Isaac Newton would illustrate through his Experimentum Crucis that all colors were effects of light rather than substances in themselves. And it does not help that the shift to print with woodblock or engraved images also often meant a shift from a colored manuscript to a black and white image. Thus, for centuries, something like the Mexican Codex Mendoza would be studied by scholars via the black and white printed engravings that were made from them, making the color seem negligible. And I think it's no accident that nowadays, with digital media, we can pay much more attention to color. Again, if you want to, you can read the whole Codex Mendoza and look at the original colors as digital versions on your computer. Indeed, some natural historians, particularly in the later 17th and 18th century, preferred not to depict colors at all when depicting parts of nature, since they were so variable and could be seen as accidental rather than an objective part of identifying a species. New accounts of changes wrought in scientific practice of the period, however, have challenged this predominance of a mechanical or mathematical worldview. The history of alchemy, which situates color centrally as a means to understand and engage nature, is currently enjoying a comeback. It used to be that alchemy was considered the last of the sciences to undergo a thorough reform in the early modern period, not until development of chemistry in the 18th century. Now it is often recognized that Paracelsus, a contemporary of Copernicus, was one of the first to offer a complete natural philosophy challenging the ancients with a fundamentally different understanding of the basic workings of matters. So the history of alchemy has really been recuperated in the past couple of years. Numerous exhibitions and events just this past year have brought attention both to color as well as to alchemy. And this new line of research is revealing how much more sophisticated pre-Newtonian color research was than we have thought. For instance, it is often assumed that pre-Newtonian color research was primarily concerned with colored bodies, conceptualized as real color rather than apparent colors or fluctuating effects of light. And this is seen as one of the faults of pre-Newtonian color research once Newton reveals that all color is light, and so it's a misconception. However, as scholars like Anne Golgar have described in the case of tulips, contemporaries were fascinated also with other iridescent qualities, with luster, with colors of objects like feathers or of tulip petals that not only appeared unpredictably, it seemed, from the bulb, but also shift with shifting light. Craftsmen attempted to achieve these effects through developing sophisticated varnishes, cutting velvet or intertwining it with metallic threads in sophisticated ways, or dyeing cloth in layers of color so that it seemed to iridesce with shifting light like the feathers of a peacock. In fact, Pavonazzo, peacock-colored, was one of the popular colors worn by cardinals like Francesco Barberini, that especially on rustling silk would catch the light and shift with it dramatically. So there's probably a rich red kermes, which is a European insect dye, then dipped into a blue that would be used on things like velvet, damask, and silk to achieve this shimmering peacock effect. Barberini's collection of research on different dyeing techniques and ingredients gathered for the purposes of setting up his tapestry works, and I thank Jamie Harper for pointing me to these particular group of manuscripts, pay a great deal of attention not just to depth of color but also to luster. So Barberini collects information about where the most lustrous dyes could be achieved. So not just how brilliant a color is, but also how much it shines, how it has these effects of relating to different views and different light sources. Barberini's notes also repeatedly refer to the new dyes available from the Americas, superior to the madder and kermes and other dyes long available in Europe. Such fantastic new colors offered one way that explorers of nature, such as the Academy of the Lynx-eyed, the scientific academy of which Barberini was a member, encountered and mastered New World nature. This Spanish physician, Francisco Hernandez of Toledo, had been sent by the King of Spain on a mission to uncover medicinal knowledge in the New World, and he collected vast amounts of information on medical plants. The Linceans, the members of the Academy of the Lynx-eyed, published a heavily annotated version of Hernandez's study in Rome in 1628, dedicated to our Francesco Barberini. And as Hernandez pointed out, new dyestuffs were one of the most commercially exciting possibilities of the New World. As he said, "What shall I say of the different dyes unknown to us, which they make from flowers, fruits, roots, leaves, bark, stones, wood, and other materials?" Many Mexican manuscripts already available in the Vatican, as well as in the Barberini Library, demonstrated the vivid pigments used in the New World and as yet unavailable in Europe. Chief among them was the cochineal insect, used as a medicine, a textile dye, and an ink. While European motifs infiltrated New World textiles, such as the 17th century Peruvian textile, New World colors, such as cochineal, very quickly integrated into dyeing of wool and silk for tapestries and other textiles, as in this late 16th century tapestry, or this chasuble, which is dyed with American cochineal for Antonio Barberini in the 1620s. Bringing the art of dyeing with cochineal from the New World to the Old, and from other textile centers such as Flanders to Rome, represented a means of amplifying the greatness and magnificence of a polity, according to the political theory of the time. For instance, one of my favorite writers, an ex-Jesuit and assistant to Cardinal Borromeo in Milan and later to the Dukes of Savoy, Giovanni Botero, had celebrated the political usefulness of luxurious crafts in a groundbreaking work published in Rome in 1589. His chapter on industry and his causes of the greatness and magnificence of cities celebrated the far greater value that craft added to the products of nature. For instance, as an early English translation put it, "Wool is but a simple fruit and root of nature, but what a sight of good things, and what variety and sundry forms and fashions doth art make of thereof. How many and how great commodities doth the industry of the collier draw out of it? Who doth get it carded, picked, spun, warped, weaved, dyed, fulled, thicked, fashioned, and formed after 1,000 ways? And do not the transportation of it from place to place increase a great profit too? Silk is also a simple fruit of nature, but what variety of most gallant and beautiful clothes doth art frame thereof? It makes the very excrement of a base and baggage worm, highly esteemed with princes, and greatly apprized of queens. To be short, it makes every man to brave him and bedeck him in it." So in this, Botero is really speaking to a central transformation of mores that took place in Europe in this time, which we now realize is fundamental to the emergence of experimental science, and that is the rivalry between art and nature. Is nature, coming from the divine, always superior to the artificial products of fallen mankind, or does art in fact surpass nature? And has art been put on this world, as someone like Paracelsus would say, in order to perfect or to complete the work of nature by God? And so this rivalry between art and nature is here framed as a political issue by Botero, as the fundamental way that a prince who is the artist of his state can take nature, can take the raw ingredients of his resources around the globe. And Botero also published travel accounts from sources drawn from around the globe, as well as the rude materials of his people, and through his artistry transform them into the most glorious and most magnificent polity possible. And these were exactly the types of sources that heads of state all over Europe, and particularly in this Italian context, would have been reading. Botero particularly praised Flanders, which had managed to attract the textile industry away from England, who now sold their raw wool to Flanders to be made into textiles and re-exported at far greater expense back to England. The textile industry became a textbook example of the power of attracting both raw natural ingredients and the industry to transform them from around the world, envisioning what we now call the market as an agonistic rivalry between states, each trying to drain the other of maximum value. Guido Pancheroli, a jurist at Padua who also circulated in Botero's orbit between Savoy and Rome, set this emulative rivalry up as one between times rather than between places. Pancheroli belonged to a circle of antiquarian scholars, including Cassiano del Pozzo, Barberini's secretary, and he brought a profound knowledge of antiquity to bear upon his analysis of contemporary resources and how they compare to the past. So just like the rivalry between art and nature that was at the foundation of Botero's new political thought, which he coined the reason of state, Guido Pancheroli set up the rivalry between antiquity and modernity in new terms. That was another major debate of this period that we call the scientific revolution. Pancheroli had published a well-known edition of the ancient Roman Notitia Dignitatum, a late antique administrative manuscript of the Roman Empire that included an extensive discussion of ancient heraldic colors and their significance, as, for example, in these escutcheons, an important manuscript of which was held in the Barberini library. And his Notitia Dignitatum was really a scholarly edition, but he also published actually first in Latin, and then it came out posthumously. It circulated in manuscript in, Italian, and then it came out posthumously in print in Latin later. A real bestseller. His two books of Things Lost and Things Found. And we do have this in our collection with this wonderful engraving. I encourage you all to go and take a look at it. Here he compared all the things that the modern age had compared to all the things it had lost in the fall of ancient Rome. Like he said, merchants compare columns of credits and debits to see how their accounts stand. Who's winning out here? Antiquity or modernity? And so you can see on one side turning away from us modernity with kind of a tumbling architecture in the background. There's a little hint at the idea of the ever-burning lamps of the ancients that were supposedly discovered, still burning for hundreds of years, but at the first whiff of modern light, when they were dug up, they would expire. And that was a major topic of research as well. Fortunio Luceto, another member of the Lincean Academy, studied this topic at length in a book on ancient lamps that he published. And then, compared to the ancient world, we have two modern inventions on the bottom there. And the very bottom, we have the printing press, a little printing house. And on the right, we have guns, cannons. So the printing press, guns, and compass being the famous three modern inventions, the compass signified by the New World. And we also have, I think, a rather sinister figure behind our New World inhabitant who is carrying a musket on his shoulder, conquistador, back there. And so we have this kind of comparison of turning towards us the New World, turning away from us ancient Rome. Ancient Rome is extremely crowded. It is full of relics. It's very interesting, but it is broken. And the New World is kind of beckoning as this kind of open landscape ready for exploration. And the question is, which is better? Would you rather return to the past or explore the New World? In Pancheroli's account, antiquity was actually doing better. He has way more lost ancient things than he has New World things. And he's really framing a debate rather than giving us an example. But some of the items on his list actually incorporate many other things. So for example, number one on his list of New World discoveries was the New World itself, which contains a lot of things in it. While number one on his column of debits of the lost ancient things was in fact ancient purple, as you can see all the way up there on number one. way above other things like the Forum, libraries, bathhouses, triumphal arches. Purple is absolutely number one of the things of antiquity that we have lost here. And so we have to ask ourselves why this color, the poison of a venomous sea snail, deserves pride of place in this competition between antiquity and modernity. So the Linceans paid a great deal of attention to ancient purple, with one member, Fabio Colonna, for example, publishing an entire study of it in 1616. And this is an image of the sea snail, the purpura, from which the word purple comes. And the Barberini Library, as it happens, although it probably was not known to them, and here's a lovely image of the Barberini Library, was an exceptional resource when it comes to ancient purple. So purple pages, if you think of the terms of like purple prose, purple pages in Carolingian and Ottonian manuscripts imitating Byzantine manuscripts are often assumed by scholars today to have been colored with this amazing ancient Tyrian purple. But a recent extensive study testing many early manuscripts has found actual ancient purple on only a single page of a single manuscript from the Barberini collection. So the Barberini Gospels, the 8th century Barberini Gospels, on page 125 recto, there is Tyrian purple in this pinkish background right here. And that's the only actual Tyrian purple that has been found in the study of all these Carolingian and Ottonian purple pages. So for many contemporaries, accustomed to Pancioli's manner of constant comparison between ancient and modern things, the lost ancient purple could be balanced by newfound reds, as argued, for example, the Venetian physician Pietro Maria Canapari in a 1619 work on inks. It's a really fascinating work. He has a lot on ancient purple of the ancients and all of their differences. And of course, the reason why purple reaches such status is because of its association with empire and a way to kind of demonstrate an aesthetics of empire. And his comparison is with recent purple, and all the way at the bottom, we get his reference to Mexican grana over there, which would be to cochineal as one of the competitors with ancient purple. At the time that he is writing, the person I researched, Cornelis Drebbel, had not yet invented his amazing cochineal dye that would make a brilliant scarlet. And you could not, in fact, make a scarlet out of cochineal. So the colors of cochineal, and those of you who came to the workshop just before this in special collections would have seen, before then, before the 1620s, they would have been a range of purples. So it's a little less odd that it seems, when we think about cochineal as red primarily, to compare cochineal as a purple to the lost ancient purple. But this becomes a commonplace. A lot of people compare the modern Mexican cochineal. It really helps that it is from the New World to the lost ancient purple as one of those ways to say, who has it better, antiquity or modernity? Are we progressing or are we regressing is the big question of the day. So the art of dyeing red fast with cochineal, especially on silk, a very complicated chemical reaction, very difficult to achieve, became an issue not only of immense potential economic value, but of cultural prestige, because it allowed you to prove that you had the ability to master nature, that you had rediscovered this lost ability that had belonged to the ancient Roman Empire, and you could compete with the past. So today I've taken us on an imaginative journey to reimagine the colors of tapestry not only in their original aesthetic vividness, but in the richness of association that applied in the time to the dyeing of textiles. At stake in the ability to dye a cloth a vivid red was competition between art and nature, the ancient and the New World, forming the very basis of a grand and magnificent society, according to Botero and Pancioli. This, I argue, should urge us to look with a new eye at the standard backdrop of Baroque art, the theatrical red swag of cloth that appears to take on a life of its own. A wonderful example, of course, is the Allegory of Italy, which Louise Rice, in the symposium here last November, brilliantly reinterpreted as applying far more directly to the Barberini household. So the drapery here moves irrationally, as in, for example, the tapestries themselves, wherein we have a dramatic backdrop to the Annunciation. And of course, it's far more faded. We have to reimagine the depth of this red once would have had, where the heavy cloth seems to hang from a cloud. There we go. Just to give us a dramatic backcloth, we have this kind of irrational, heavy swag hanging down from the heavens. So art historians have interpreted such irrationality of drapery as opposed to the rationality of perspective and of Enlightenment order in a postmodern way as a sign of, quote, the theatrical, the fragmented, the irrational, the chaotic, the unfinished, and the hybrid, as Dendoy put it. Such drapery, according to him and others, represented a pre-industrial society that would be vanquished by the triumph of empiricism and new scientific systems put forward by heroes of the scientific revolution, such as Newton and Locke. Yet, as I've attempted to suggest here, such prominently theatrical drapery in fact itself represents a triumph of mastery over space, time, and matter, a celebration of the power of luxury and industry that in fact undergirded new overarching economic theories that would become even more important in the Enlightenment, and a demonstration of humanity's ability to know and mold nature to its demands. It is only against a pallid view of the scientific revolution, drained of all of its tinctures, revolving merely around number, weight, and measure, that such forceful statements of color could appear anti-scientific. Once we have reimagined Baroque science in its original vivid color, we can also begin to see Baroque tapestry in a new light. Thank you. So I'm very happy to take any and all questions, especially if you want to hear more about the mysterious research that I did not talk about. Yes. Yeah. Is that?
It is, sorry.
Yeah.
So Vera, my questions are kind of frivolous one. I like to start off with silly. You're probably aware that in the Middle Ages, that in some northern French Gothic cathedral towns, they've been projecting light onto the facades, colored light, to let people see at night the fanciful ideas of what the statues might look like when they were painted. Has anyone done anything to try to make visible to us, even in a jokey, clownish, sort of exaggerated fashion, how these might have looked in their colorful glory?
Not that I'm aware of. I think Professor Harper would definitely be the person to ask that question. So the question was, has anyone ever tried to project light onto these tapestries to help us reimagine it? But not that I'm aware of. Shall we say I think tapestries are more niche than sculpture? Haha. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, they've done that in some museums, but not with these Barberini masters. They have them
Projecting light on tapestry.
yes. And the other thing I was going to ask you, did they dye with madder at the same time?
Yes.
It seems funny to me to think of the cochineal as the modern, because when I've been to Mexico, they say this is the ancient traditional way of dyeing red. Do we know when it started in Mesoamerica?
I don't know when it started in Mesoamerica, that's for sure. And also, there's also European versions of cochineal. So there's cochineal in Armenia, Old World versions, Armenian cochineal. There's also kermes, which is an insect that is very similar in terms of the dye that it produces as cochineal. So it's not as dramatic in terms of being an entirely unknown entity. As was pointed out in the workshop that some of the audience just attended when we looked at some of the cochineal with Marie-France Lemay, who's come over from Yale, the cochineal was far more productive of dye than kermes had been. So it was a lot more economically important in terms of how much dye you could get out of it versus a kermes. But we also have to keep in mind that a lot of these things were not being used for a single use. So cochineal is also a medicine. It also has all sorts of other knowledge associated with it. And that's exactly the type of thing that someone like Hernandez was sent to collect. So it's not like the European audience is unaware of the fact that this is a long-standing form of Mexican both dye and medicine. They know that, and they want that, and they want to attract it to their polity, and it's part of this whole agonistic rivalry of taking something and kind of making it your own. So I think we need to adjust a little bit our expectations of novelty. We think of innovation as something that we think of out of the blue. It didn't exist before, and we discover something for the first time. But invention in this period still meant to come upon something, in venire. You come upon something that was already there, you take it, you make it your own. And so this is the way they would have conceptualized coming upon cochineal. They didn't think this up out of the blue. It was being used, but the discovery aspect is of them going, taking it, bringing it back, making it their own, and trying to compete economically. Yeah.
Yes, it
I'm
looks
sorry.
like the blue and the red held up reasonably well. And the skin tones and many other dyes seem to have faded. Do you know what dyes those were?
I do not. Once again, I have to point you in the direction of Professor Harper and the lab back at St. John the Divine who worked on these matches. I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer very specific questions about these particular tapestries. There was a hand over here. Yeah.
Yes, I was interested in the Purpurea snails. Were they cultivated in the sense of farmed, or were they just gathered naturally?
They were gathered naturally, and in fact, they were never actually lost. They was always some people that knew about them. They were just not widely known. And then when some people find them in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1680s again and bring it to the attention of learned Europe, it's a huge deal. So, for example, the Oxford Philosophical Society has an informant who has located a source for this. And if you open up the book of their minutes, which is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, you'll come across a page which is a piece of linen that has staining in purple on it, and including the date and their names and the ABC, and also nullius in verba, the motto of their sister society, the Royal Society of London for Advancing Natural Knowledge, which means upon the authority of no single man. So that is a motto, a huge statement of identity, of affiliation with experimental science. And I think it really speaks to this whole project of competing with antiquity, the fact that when they rediscover ancient purple, one of the very first things they do is dye the motto of what's considered one of the most revolutionary scientific society in that color. Yeah.
You mentioned that, continuing on the purple, you mentioned that the older manuscripts mostly weren't done with that area of purple. Do you know what was used?
There's a variety of things, and Cheryl Porter is the person who did the study that you can look this up. I think often one of the purple dyes that was used is orchid. Yeah. Yeah. Way in the back.
During this time, there was great changes in stained glass, some of it coming from what they found in the New World. Is there a parallel between the development of the colors in stained glass at this time as well as the clothing?
Well, you guys are really throwing me the hard questions here. So there's a question is there parallel the development of stained glass as there was in research about dyes? So I'm not a stained glass expert. I do work on other forms of glass. Non-existent ones like malleable glass is one of my favorite topics. But a lot of the people who were researching color researched it across what some historians of science have recently called the color world. So for example, Sir Theodore de Mayerne, who is a figure I work on, is very famous now for his study of painters' techniques. He has a lot of interviews with people like Rubens and Van Dyck, and manuscripts collecting all their techniques and the paints that they used. But what people pay little attention to is that he was also researching dyes on a daily basis, experimenting with dyers. They had a huge crew of international dyers that he interrogated. He had spies that he had running around London, following people from shops, trying to see what they're buying there. All sorts of secret informants, so a massive network of intelligence gathering to try to figure out everything about dyes. He was also researching glass. He was also researching enamel. In fact, enamel miniature, which becomes a major genre of miniature later in the 18th century, is developed by Jean Petitot, an émigré artist in London, with Mayer, and they worked together to develop this. Later, the Royal Society actually asks Mayern's godson to try to steal it. So you can get a sense of the kind of atmosphere we're dealing with these secrets of art and nature. They did tend to be comprehensive across all realms of color. And so there is interest in stained glass. I know that Mayern, for example, has a description where he talks about stained glass that looks like taffeta, which struck me because I was interested in these luster effects. So he's talking about changeable colors. So he looked into that, for example. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to what extent would you say there was a stable language for talking about colors in 17th century world? And I mean across the regions, like if they say purple, do we know what that actually looks like?
Right.
The period I question is the thing that obsesses art historians.
Mm-hmm.
Can we actually see what the language of that time is actually talking about?
There was not, which was why, and I actually used to have this in my slides and I took it out. There was an effort by fellows of the Royal Society to develop a stable language, and there was one fellow in particular who actually published the Philosophical Transactions, the journal of the Society, along with a manuscript insert that had all the colors of his new system on it so that people could refer to this as a system. Because that was one of the issues, not just for art historians, but for historians of science and for people in the period. If there's this strange new fish and I want to depict it in a book, and I give my printed book to someone to hand color, what are they going to color it? How do they know if the text calls it light green, what kind of green that is? So that is one reason why people did make the argument that you shouldn't actually have color at all in your images, because there wasn't a standard way. So there was an effort in the late 17th century to develop a standard way. It didn't really catch on, but there wasn't. Standardization, of course, is part and parcel of the whole problem of developing a written body of scientific knowledge as opposed to a more domestic culture of secrets out of which experimental science evolved. So to me, the issue of a standard language for describing color is no different than the standard language for describing temperature, which also didn't exist, or anything else, really. Yeah?
You said that mechanical philosophy kind of took out a lot of conversation of the importance of color. What were some of the developments that removed the importance of color?
In historiography of science right now, it has been the recuperation of alchemy. So one thing that happened was that in the 19th century, 18th somewhat, but mostly 19th century, a lot of the alchemical interests of some of the people that became canonized as the heroes inventing modern science were kind of pushed under the rug, purposely taken out of their archives, purposely taken out of the archive of Robert Boyle, purposely ignored in the case of Isaac Newton, who's a major alchemist. And so it was only beginning a couple of decades ago. Betty Jo Teeter-Dobbs, for example, in 1979, I believe, wrote The Hunting of the Green Lion, which kind of for the first time exposed Isaac Newton, the primary mechanical philosopher, supposedly, as a major alchemist. And Robert Boyle is also a major alchemist. So it became undeniable to see alchemy as actually one of the central and, in fact, overarching ways in which experimental science was developed. And color is absolutely central to alchemy, so that has been one of the venues through which color has now become a big topic of discussion. I think that, oh, one more.
I was going to ask, why did they push those things away?
Oh, yeah. That's another huge topic. That is a really good question. And it really has a lot to do, we can talk about it personally, but it really has a lot to do more with the persona of what an appropriate scientist would be in a new era of institutions, of government-supported science, of academic science. They do not approve of a lot of the kind of social aspects of alchemy, with its culture of secrecy, with its rather flamboyant characters. And so there was a kind of distancing effect or vulgarizing effect that what had been essential science, and this you see this happening very often in the history of science, that what had been a central part of science gets considered relegated to madmen or projectors or people that you can't trust, when that had not been the case. But it was really, I would argue, more for social reasons and institutional and political reasons than for scientific or theoretical ones. Thank you.